Down to his last few dollars, Marcus Thompson stands outside Westside Storage Auctions, clutching a crumpled $20 bill. The homeless shelter kicked him out this morning, and his cardboard sign hasn't earned enough for tonight's meal. When the auctioneer opens Unit 47B, other bidders walk away from the dusty mess inside. Broken furniture, moldy boxes, and what looks like decades of forgotten junk. But Marcus sees opportunity where others see worthless clutter. His desperate $20 bid wins him a storage unit full of mysteries. As he digs through boxes of old clothes and broken appliances, something catches his eye. A small wooden box hidden beneath moth-eaten blankets. Inside lies an item that will connect him to a family he never knew existed and unlock secrets that transform his understanding of who he really is. What Marcus discovers in that dusty storage unit doesn't just change his circumstances. It changes everything he believed about his past and his future. But will this discovery be enough to lift him out of the darkness that has consumed his life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus had been standing outside Westside Storage Auctions for 20 minutes, watching well-dressed bidders arrive in clean cars while he clutched his wrinkled $20 bill. The morning sun beat down on his unwashed hair, and he could smell his own body odor mixing with the scent of exhaust fumes from the parking lot. 3 years of homelessness had taught him to become invisible, but today he needed to be seen, to participate in a world that had long since written him off. The story of how Marcus Thompson ended up here began with a cascade of disasters that felt like dominoes falling in slow motion. A factory closure had cost him his job at 42. Then his wife Sarah left, taking their daughter Emma to her mother's house in another state. The divorce papers arrived the same week he learned about the tumor in his kidney. Surgery saved his life but destroyed his finances. Medical bills consumed his savings, then his house, then his dignity. The shelter had rules. You couldn't stay during the day, and you had to be back by 6 for dinner and a bed. But Marcus had learned that auction houses were warm places where a man could sit in the back and pretend to belong. He'd discovered Westside Storage 3 months ago, watching wealthy collectors and dealers bid thousands on storage units filled with antiques and hidden treasures. Pete Martinez, the auctioneer, was a weathered man in his 60s who'd been running these auctions for 20 years. He had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and never made Marcus feel unwelcome. Sometimes Pete would nod at him during slow moments, a small acknowledgement that Marcus still existed in a world that preferred to look away. "All right. Folks, we've got 15 units today," Pete announced to the crowd of about 30 bidders. "Remember the rules, cash only. You get 48 hours to clean out your unit, and everything gets sold as is. No returns, no complaints if you find a family of raccoons inside." The crowd chuckled, and Marcus found himself smiling for the first time in days. These people had money to gamble on mystery boxes. They drove pickup trucks and wore work boots, or arrived in BMWs wearing designer clothes. They were dealers, collectors, and weekend treasure hunters who could afford to lose a few $100s on a bad guess. Marcus watched them bid on the first several units. A nicely organized unit with visible furniture went for $800. Another with tools and equipment brought in $1,200. The bidders had developed a language of casual wealth. $500 here, $750 there, spoken like ordering coffee. When they reached Unit 47B, the energy in the crowd shifted. Pete cut the lock and rolled up the metal door to reveal a chaotic mess that made several bidders shake their heads immediately. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, furniture was clearly damaged, and everything had the dusty, neglected look of abandonment. A broken recliner sat at odd angles, its stuffing visible through tears in the fabric. Cardboard boxes had collapsed under the weight of other items, spilling clothes and papers across the concrete floor. "Well, this one's seen better days," Pete said with practiced diplomacy. "Looks like someone left in a hurry. Could be treasures buried in there, could be junk. That's the gamble, folks. The serious bidders walked away quickly. A few curious people poked their heads in for a closer look, but Marcus could see the dismissal in their body language. This wasn't the kind of unit that promised easy profits or obvious treasures. "Let's start the bidding at $50, Pete announced. Silence. "Okay. 25? More silence. The remaining bidders were already moving toward the next unit. Marcus felt his heart pounding. This was his chance, maybe his only chance. $20 was everything he had, but it was also nothing. He wouldn't eat today anyway, and the shelter would let him sleep on the floor if all the beds were taken. But this unit might contain something, anything, that could change his circumstances. $20, Marcus called out, his voice cracking slightly. Pete looked surprised but nodded. "I've got 20. Anyone else want to jump in? It's a big unit, lots of potential." The other bidders barely glanced back. They were focused on the next unit, which looked more promising from the outside. 20 going once, 20 going twice. Pete's gavel came down. "Sold to the gentleman in the back." "Come on up and get your key, sir." Marcus walked forward on unsteady legs, aware that everyone was watching him now. He handed Pete his crumpled $20 bill and received a small silver key in return. The key was warm from Pete's hand and felt heavier than it should have. "Good luck in there," Pete said quietly, pressing the key into Marcus's palm. "Sometimes the units nobody wants are the ones that surprise you." Marcus stood before Unit 47B for several minutes after the other bidders had moved on, the small silver key growing warm in his sweaty palm. The metal roll-up door remained open, revealing the chaos inside like a mouthful of broken teeth. The afternoon sun slanted through the doorway, illuminating dust motes that danced above the scattered contents like tiny spirits. He stepped inside carefully, his worn sneakers crunching on broken glass from what appeared to be a shattered picture frame. The 10x10 space felt larger than his corner at the shelter, but infinitely more overwhelming. Where did someone even begin with such disorder? Everything seemed to have been thrown in hastily, as if someone had needed to vacate quickly and without care for organization. The broken recliner dominated the center of the space, its brown leather cracked and faded. One arm had completely separated from the frame, and white stuffing spilled out like cotton clouds. Behind it, a wooden dresser with 3 drawers stood at an angle. Its mirror cracked in a spiderweb pattern that reflected Marcus's face in fractured pieces. Cardboard boxes were stacked everywhere, some labeled in faded black marker with words like kitchen and bedroom, others unmarked and sealed with yellowed tape. Many had collapsed under the weight of items piled on top, creating small avalanches of clothing, books, and household items across the concrete floor. Marcus picked up a woman's blue sweater that had fallen from one of the damaged boxes. It was soft wool, well made, the kind of garment that spoke of middle-class comfort. He held it up to the light and noticed tiny moth holes near the collar. Whoever had owned this sweater had lived a different life than Marcus. A life where cashmere sweaters and matching scarves mattered. A box labeled photos had burst open, spilling dozens of pictures across the floor. Marcus knelt down and gathered them carefully, studying the faces of strangers who had once been important enough to photograph and preserve. There were birthday parties with elaborate cakes, Christmas mornings with children tearing into wrapped presents, family gatherings around dinner tables laden with food. One photograph stopped him cold. It showed a young man in military uniform, standing straight and proud beside a woman in a white dress. The photo was black and white, clearly from decades ago, but something about the man's face seemed familiar. Marcus held it closer to the light, studying the strong jawline and deep-set eyes. The resemblance was faint but unmistakable. The man looked like Marcus might have looked 20 years ago, before homelessness had carved lines of exhaustion and defeat into his features. He flipped the photo over and found writing in faded blue ink. James and Sarah Thompson. Wedding day, June 15, 1956. Thompson. The same surname that appeared on Marcus's birth certificate. The one piece of identification he'd managed to keep through 3 years of living on the streets. Marcus's hands began to shake as he gathered more photographs. Here was James Thompson in his army uniform, with a group of fellow soldiers. Here was Sarah Thompson holding a baby, her face radiant with new motherhood. Here were birthday celebrations, holidays, ordinary moments of happiness that someone had cared enough to preserve. Could these be his grandparents? Marcus had grown up in foster care after his parents died in a car accident when he was 7. He'd never known his extended family, never had anyone to tell him stories about where he came from or who his people were. His social worker had mentioned that his father had been estranged from his family, but no details were ever provided. He continued exploring the unit with new urgency. No longer seeing junk, but potential connections to a past he'd never known existed. A box of books revealed titles like The Art of War and Home Gardening for Beginners. Another contained kitchen items, cast iron pans, ceramic mixing bowls, and a set of china with delicate blue flowers that had somehow survived the chaos. In the back corner, beneath a musty tarpaulin, Marcus discovered what appeared to be a cedar chest. The wood was dark with age, but still beautiful, carved with intricate patterns of roses and vines. Unlike everything else in the unit, the chest seemed to have been placed carefully, protected from the disorder around it. The chest was locked, secured with an old-fashioned brass lock that looked like it required a skeleton key. Marcus searched through the scattered items, hoping to find the key among the debris. He checked coat pockets, the drawers of the damaged dresser, and inside several small boxes, but found nothing. As the afternoon wore on and the auction house began to empty, Marcus realized he was running out of time. The facility would close soon, and he'd need to return tomorrow to continue his exploration. But he couldn't stop thinking about that photograph, about the name Thompson, about the possibility that this chaos might contain answers to questions he'd carried his entire life. He gathered the most promising items near the front of the unit. The box of photographs, some of the nicer clothing, and anything that might contain personal documents. Tomorrow he would return with better light and more time to search for the key to that mysterious cedar chest. Marcus returned to the storage unit the next morning, carrying a borrowed flashlight from the shelter and a thermos of coffee that one of the volunteers had given him. The night had been restless, filled with dreams of the photograph and questions about the Thompson name that matched his own. He'd barely slept, his mind racing with possibilities he didn't dare fully believe. The morning light revealed details he'd missed the day before. As he moved deeper into the unit, systematically checking every box and corner, he noticed that beneath the apparent chaos lay evidence of a life carefully lived. The damaged furniture was quality craftsmanship, solid wood construction that had simply suffered from poor storage conditions. The scattered clothing, when examined closely, showed the kind of attention to detail that spoke of people who took pride in their appearance. Marcus spent 2 hours methodically searching for a key to the cedar chest, growing increasingly frustrated as each promising hiding spot yielded nothing. He checked inside books, beneath loose papers, in the pockets of every piece of clothing, and even felt along the undersides of furniture for anything that might be taped there. Then, as he lifted a particularly heavy box of kitchen items, he heard something rattle inside. The box was labeled Sarah's Things, in the same faded handwriting he'd seen on the photograph. Inside, beneath layers of tissue paper that had yellowed with age, he found china teacups wrapped with the kind of care that suggested they held special meaning. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in a piece of silk fabric, was a small brass key. It was ornate, with an intricate design that matched the lock on the cedar chest perfectly. Marcus held it up to the light, noting how the metal had developed a patina that spoke of age and use. This wasn't just any key. It had been treasured, protected, kept safe for a reason. His hands trembled as he approached the cedar chest. The moment felt heavy with significance, as if he were about to cross a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. What if the chest contained nothing of importance? What if his hopes about the Thompson connection were just the desperate fantasies of a man who had lost everything. But what if they weren't? Marcus knelt beside the chest and inserted the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, as if it had been waiting decades for this moment. The mechanism clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo in the small space. He lifted the heavy wooden lid, and the scent that emerged was like stepping into another time. Cedar and lavender, old paper, and something indefinably precious. The chest was lined with deep burgundy fabric that had faded but retained its elegance. Inside, everything was arranged with the kind of careful organization that spoke of someone who understood the value of preservation. This wasn't storage. This was a shrine to memory. The first item Marcus lifted out was a wooden jewelry box, smaller but crafted with the same attention to detail as the chest itself. The wood was a rich mahogany that had been polished to a warm glow, and the corners were reinforced with small brass fittings. When he opened it, a tiny ballerina began to turn slowly to the tinkling melody of Für Elise. Inside the jewelry box, nestled in compartments lined with white silk, were pieces that told a story of special occasions and cherished moments. A pearl necklace lay coiled like a sleeping snake, each pearl perfectly matched and lustrous despite its age. Beside it, a man's pocket watch ticked steadily, its gold case engraved with the initials J.T., James Thompson. Marcus lifted the watch carefully, feeling its substantial weight in his palm. The crystal face was clear, showing Roman numerals and delicate hands that continued their eternal dance. When he turned it over, he found an inscription in script so elegant it must have been done by a professional engraver. To James, my heart's true compass. Forever yours, Sarah. June 15th, 1956, the wedding date from the photograph. Marcus's throat tightened with emotion as he realized he was holding something that had been given with love, worn with pride, and preserved with reverence. This wasn't just a timepiece, it was a declaration of devotion that had survived decades of separation. Beneath the jewelry box, wrapped in tissue paper that crinkled with age, Marcus found what appeared to be a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The paper was cream-colored and heavy, the kind used for important correspondence. The top envelope bore an address in Korea and a postmark from 1953. His heart raced as he understood what he was looking at. These were love letters, correspondence between James and Sarah during his military service. The handwriting on the envelopes was masculine and confident, while the return address labels were written in the same delicate script he'd seen on the photograph. Marcus sat back on his heels, overwhelmed by the weight of what he'd discovered. This wooden box wasn't just a container. It was a repository of love, a careful collection of the most precious moments in two people's lives. Someone had chosen each item deliberately, arranging them with the kind of care reserved for things that matter more than life itself. The morning light streaming through the storage unit doorway seemed different now, softer somehow, as if it were illuminating not just dust and forgotten belongings, but the possibility of connection. Across time and loss, Marcus's fingers shook as he untied the faded blue ribbon that bound the bundle of letters together. The silk had deteriorated over the decades, coming apart in places where it had been folded, but it had served its purpose of keeping these precious documents safe and organized. There were perhaps 30 letters in total, arranged in chronological order, with the oldest postmarks from 1952 and the newest from 1955. He selected the first letter carefully, noting how the envelope had yellowed around the edges but remained intact. The postmark read Seoul, Korea, and was dated October 15, 1952. The return address was written in strong, masculine handwriting, per James R. Thompson, 2nd Infantry Division. Apo 248. Marcus's hands trembled as he realized he was about to read words written by the man in the wedding photograph, the man who might be his grandfather. The letter inside was written on military stationery, the kind of thin paper designed to be lightweight for international mail. James's handwriting was careful and deliberate, each letter formed with the precision of someone who understood that these words might be the most important he would ever write. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began, "I hope this finds you well and safe at home. The nights here are cold, but thinking of your warm smile keeps me going through the darkest hours. I carry your photograph next to my heart, and it has become more precious to me than any medal or commendation." Marcus read slowly, savoring each word. James wrote about the mundane details of military life, the food, the weather, the friendships he'd formed with fellow soldiers. But woven through these ordinary observations was a love so profound it seemed to radiate from the yellowed paper. He wrote about dreams of returning home, of building a life with Sarah, of the farm they would buy and the children they would raise. "I think about our wedding every day," James continued in that first letter. "June seems impossibly far away, but I know that every sunrise brings me one day closer to making you my wife. I've been saving every penny of my pay, and I've already written to Mr. Henderson about that property outside town. He says he'll hold it for us until I return. Can you imagine, Sarah? Our own land, our own home, a place where we can build something that will last." Marcus set the first letter aside and reached for one of Sarah's responses. Her handwriting was elegant and flowing, the script of someone who had been taught penmanship as an art form. The paper was different too. Personal stationery, with her initials embossed at the top in small, graceful letters. "My beloved James," Sarah's letter began. "Your letter arrived yesterday, and I must have read it a dozen times already. Mother says I'm wearing out the paper, but I can't help myself. Your words are like a lifeline, connecting me to you across all these terrible miles." Sarah wrote about her work at the local school, where she taught second grade while waiting for James to return. She described the students with affection and humor, painting pictures of children who reminded Marcus of himself at that age, eager, curious, sometimes mischievous. She wrote about her dreams for their future family, about the children she hoped they would have, and the values they would instill in them. "I've been learning to cook from your mother," Sarah continued. "She's teaching me to make that apple pie you love so much. I burned the first 3 attempts, but I think I'm finally getting the hang of it. She says the secret is in the crust. You have to handle it gently, with patience and care. Rather like love, I suppose." Marcus found himself smiling as he read about Sarah's cooking disasters and domestic adventures. There was something deeply comforting about these glimpses into ordinary life, into the daily routines and small concerns that made up the fabric of a relationship. These weren't grand romantic gestures. They were the steady, constant expressions of love that sustained a couple through separation and uncertainty. As he continued reading, Marcus began to piece together the story of James and Sarah's courtship and separation. They had known each other since childhood, growing up in the same small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. James had been drafted shortly after proposing, leaving Sarah to plan their wedding while he served overseas. The letters revealed the depth of their commitment to each other and their shared vision for the future. They wrote about the farm they would buy, the house they would build, the traditions they would establish. James described his plans for crop rotation and livestock management with the enthusiasm of someone who understood that farming wasn't just a job, but a way of life. Sarah wrote about the hope chest she was filling, with linens and household items for their future home. She described each addition with pride. Embroidered pillowcases she'd made herself, quilts passed down from her grandmother, china she'd saved for months to purchase. Every item represented another step toward the life they would build together, but it was the name Thompson that appeared throughout the correspondence that made Marcus's heart race. These weren't just any love letters. They were the correspondence of people who shared his surname, people who might be the family he'd never known existed. The possibility filled him with a mixture of hope and terror that was almost overwhelming. In one letter, James wrote about his plans for the future. "I want to build something that will last for generations. Sarah, a place where our children and our children's children can know where they come from and what their family stands for." Beneath the letters, wrapped in a protective plastic sleeve that had yellowed with age. Marcus discovered a manila folder containing official military documents. The folder was labeled James R. Thompson, service record, in the same careful handwriting he'd seen on the letters. His pulse quickened as he realized he was about to learn the official story behind the personal correspondence he'd just read. The first document was James's discharge papers, stamped with official seals and signatures that proclaimed his honorable completion of military service. But it was the second document that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat, a citation for the Bronze Star Medal. Complete with the actual medal still pinned to the official certificate, the Bronze Star itself was tarnished but intact, suspended from a red, white and blue ribbon that had faded but retained its dignity. The five-pointed star bore the relief of another smaller star in its center, and around the edges were the words, United States of America. Marcus had seen such medals before, usually in documentaries about war heroes, but he'd never held one in his hands. The citation read, informal military, language that seemed to barely contain the drama of what it described for heroic achievement in ground operations against an armed enemy near Heartbreak Ridge, Korea, on October 23, 1953. Private First Class Thompson displayed exceptional courage under enemy fire when his squad was pinned down by machine gun positions. Disregarding his personal safety, he single-handedly flanked the enemy position and neutralized the threat, allowing his wounded comrades to be evacuated. His selfless actions and devotion to duty reflect great credit upon himself and the United States Army. Marcus read the citation 3 times, trying to imagine the young man from the wedding photograph in the heat of battle, making split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death for his fellow soldiers. The James Thompson who wrote tender love letters to Sarah was the same man who had charged enemy machine gun nests to save his friends. Not attached to the citation were several black and white photographs that appeared to have been taken during James's service in Korea. In one, he stood with his squad in front of military tents, their faces showing the mix of exhaustion and camaraderie that Marcus recognized from war documentaries. James was easy to identify. He had the same strong jawline and determined expression that Marcus had noticed. In the wedding photograph, another photograph showed James receiving the Bronze Star from a colonel whose name was written on the back. Colonel Morrison presenting decoration to PFC Thompson. November 1953. James stood at attention, his uniform pressed despite the field conditions, his expression serious and proud. Looking at the photograph, Marcus felt a surge of pride that surprised him with its intensity. There were other documents in the folder. Medical records showing treatment for minor injuries, performance evaluations that consistently rated James as an exemplary soldier, and letters of commendation from his commanding officers. One evaluation, signed by a Captain Rodriguez, noted that PFC Thompson demonstrates natural leadership abilities and consistently volunteers for difficult assignments. He is respected by his peers and would make an excellent candidate for promotion. Marcus found a small notebook that appeared to be James's personal log from his time in Korea. The entries were brief and factual, recording daily activities, weather conditions, and military operations. But occasionally, personal observations crept through the official tone. Received letter from Sarah today. She's teaching the Johnson boy to read. Reminds me why we're fighting, to protect the people who make the world better. One small act at a time. Another entry, dated shortly after the action that earned him the Bronze Star, was more revealing. Lost 2 good men yesterday. Rodriguez and Miller didn't make it home. I keep thinking about their families, about the letters that won't be written, the children who won't meet their fathers. The medal feels heavy, not because of the bronze, but because of what it cost. The final document in the folder was a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs, dated 1987, confirming James's eligibility for various benefits related to his military service. The letter was addressed to James R. Thompson, Rural Route 3, Millfield, Montana, a concrete address that suggested James had indeed purchased that farm he'd written about in his letters to Sarah. Marcus sat back, overwhelmed by the weight of what he'd discovered. This wasn't just any war hero. This was potentially his grandfather, a man who had served his country with distinction and earned recognition for extraordinary courage. The Bronze Star wasn't just a piece of military hardware. It was tangible proof of character, of values, of the kind of man who would charge into danger to save his friends. For someone who had grown up without knowledge of his family history, who had spent 3 years believing he had no one in the world who cared about him. These discoveries were more precious than any treasure a storage unit auction could yield. At the very bottom of the cedar chest, Marcus found what appeared to be the most treasured item of all, a leather-bound wedding album that had been wrapped in silk and placed with reverent care beneath everything else. The leather cover was rich burgundy, embossed with gold lettering that read, "James and Sarah Thompson, June 15, 1956. Despite its age, the album had been so well preserved that the leather was still supple and the gold lettering remained bright. Marcus opened the cover with trembling hands, revealing the first page, where someone had written in elegant calligraphy, "The beginning of our forever." The photographs inside were professional quality, the kind that spoke of a wedding that had been planned with love and attention to every detail. These weren't casual snapshots. They were formal portraits that captured one of the most important days in two people's lives. The first photograph showed James in his dress military uniform, looking impossibly young and handsome. His hair was neatly combed, his posture straight and proud, and his eyes held the confident gaze of a man who had survived war and was ready to embrace peace. Beside him, Sarah was radiant in a wedding dress that must have been the height of 1950s elegance. Full skirt, fitted bodice, and a veil that cascaded behind her like a waterfall of lace. Marcus studied their faces, searching for familial resemblances that might confirm his growing belief that these were his grandparents. James's strong jaw and deep-set eyes were features Marcus recognized from his own reflection, though his had been hardened by years of struggle. Sarah's gentle smile and intelligent eyes suggested the kind of woman who would have been a loving grandmother, the kind who would have baked cookies and told stories and made a grandchild feel cherished. The album contained dozens of photographs documenting every aspect of the wedding celebration. There were pictures of the ceremony itself, showing James and Sarah exchanging vows in what appeared to be a small country church. The pews were filled with family and friends, whose faces beamed with joy and approval. Marcus wondered if any of these people might still be alive, if there were relatives he'd never met who remembered this day and the couple who had started their life together with such hope. One photograph particularly caught his attention, a group shot of what appeared to be the entire extended family. James and Sarah stood in the center, surrounded by people of all ages. An elderly couple, probably James's parents, stood proudly beside their son. A younger man, who bore a strong resemblance to James, had his arm around a woman holding a small child. Could that be Marcus's father as a baby? The caption beneath the photograph, written in Sarah's careful script, identified the family members: James's parents, Robert and Margaret Thompson, brother Richard with wife Helen, and baby Richard Jr. Sarah's parents, Charles and Eleanor Mitchell. Marcus's heart pounded as he read the name Richard. His father had been named Richard Thompson, according to the few records he possessed from his time in foster care. Another photograph showed the wedding reception, held in what appeared to be a community hall, decorated with flowers and white ribbons. Long tables were laden with food, and guests were captured mid-laugh, mid-conversation, mid-celebration. There was something deeply moving about seeing this snapshot of pure happiness, this moment when the future seemed unlimited and full of promise. Marcus found pictures of the cake cutting, the first dance, and the bouquet toss. Sarah's expression throughout was one of absolute joy. the glow of a woman who was exactly where she wanted to be, with exactly the person she wanted to be with. James looked at her in every photograph as if she were the most beautiful woman in the world, his face showing the kind of love that movies try to capture but rarely achieve. The final pages of the album contained photographs from what appeared to be the honeymoon pictures of James and Sarah at various scenic locations, sometimes formal poses, sometimes candid shots that captured their happiness in quiet moments. One picture showed them standing beside a "Welcome to Montana" sign, James pointing towards something in the distance, while Sarah laughed at whatever he was saying. The last photograph in the album was perhaps the most poignant. James and Sarah standing in front of a small farmhouse, their arms around each other, looking toward the camera with expressions of contentment and anticipation. Written beneath in Sarah's handwriting were the words, "Our new home, July 1956, the beginning of everything we dreamed." Marcus closed the album carefully, his emotions overwhelming him. These weren't just wedding photographs. They were documentation of love fulfilled, dreams realized, and a life begun with intention and joy. If these were indeed his grandparents, then he came from a legacy of love, commitment, and hope that he had never known existed. After carefully placing the wedding album back in the cedar chest, Marcus noticed something he had initially overlooked: a leather document folder wedged beneath the chest's fabric lining. The folder was slim but substantial, the kind used for important legal papers. When he pulled it free, he could feel the weight of multiple documents inside. The folder was labeled in James's careful handwriting, "Property Records, Thompson Farm." Marcus's hands shook as he opened it, revealing a collection of legal documents that would change his understanding of everything. The first document was a property deed, printed on heavy paper with official seals and signatures that proclaimed its legal authority. "Warranty deed," the document proclaimed in bold letters across the top. "Know all men by these presents that Robert James Thompson and Sarah Elizabeth Thompson, husband and wife, of Millfield County, Montana, for and in consideration of the sum of $12,500, 12,500, do hereby grant, bargain, sell and convey unto themselves the following described real estate." Marcus read the legal description of the property, trying to decode the surveyor's language of sections and townships. But the essential facts were clear. James and Sarah Thompson had purchased 40 acres of farmland in rural Montana in July 1956, just 1 month after their wedding. The deed was dated July 23, 1956, and bore their signatures alongside those of the previous owners and a notary public. Attached to the deed was a hand-drawn map of the property, sketched with the careful attention of someone who understood that land was more than just acreage. It was home. The map showed the location of the farmhouse, a barn, several outbuildings, and areas designated for different crops. James had labeled each section North Pasture, cattle, South Field, wheat, East Garden, vegetables, West Orchard, apples. This wasn't just a purchase, it was a plan for a life. The folder contained other documents that told the story of the farm's development over the years. There were receipts for farming equipment, livestock purchases, and building improvements. Marcus found contracts with local businesses for crop sales, insurance policies that protected the property, and tax records that showed the farm had been profitable and well-maintained. One document particularly caught his attention: a property tax statement from the previous year. The farm was still listed under Thompson Family Trust, with taxes current and paid in full. The assessed value made Marcus's head spin, $487,000 for the land and buildings. But more importantly, the document listed a property management company as the contact for tax matters. Millfield Property Management, Inc. Marcus stared at the document, his mind racing with implications he could barely process. If this farm still existed, if it was still owned by the Thompson family, and if he could prove his connection to James and Sarah Thompson, then he might be looking at an inheritance that would transform his life completely. Another document in the folder was a will, dated 1982 and signed by both James and Sarah Thompson. The legal language was complex, but the essential meaning was clear. The farm was to be held in trust for their descendants, with specific provisions for their son Richard Thompson and his heirs. Marcus's father's name was explicitly mentioned as the primary beneficiary, with the property to pass to his children upon his death. The will included a clause that made Marcus's heart race. In the event that our son Richard Thompson predeceases us without making provisions for his minor children, the trustees are hereby authorized and directed to maintain the property and hold all income in trust until such children reach the age of majority or can be located and their identity verified. A separate document, added to the folder in 1995, was a codicil to the will signed only by Sarah Thompson. The handwriting was shakier than her earlier documents, suggesting advanced age, but the intent was clear. Having received word of our son Richard's death in an automobile accident, and having been unable to locate his surviving child, I hereby direct that the property and all accumulated income be held in trust indefinitely until such time as our grandchild can be found and his identity established. Marcus set the documents down, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was reading. According to these papers, he was potentially the sole heir to a 40-acre farm in Montana worth nearly $500,000. More than that, there was accumulated income that had been held in trust for decades, waiting for someone who might never be found. The final document in the folder was a business card for Millfield Property Management, engraved with a handwritten note from Sarah. These good people have agreed to maintain the farm and manage the trust until our grandchild is found. God willing, someday this will all make sense. The business card was recent, indicating that the property management company was still active and presumably still maintaining the farm. There was a phone number, an address, and the name of a contact person, Margaret Henley, trust administrator. Marcus realized he was holding in his hands not just proof of a potential inheritance, but a roadmap to claiming a legacy he had never known existed. Marcus sat in the storage unit for another hour, reading and rereading the property documents until he had memorized every detail. The business card for Millfield Property Management felt like it might disintegrate in his sweating palms. He'd been carrying it from the storage unit to the nearby public library, then back to the unit, unable to work up the courage to make the phone call that could change everything. The library's payphone sat in a corner near the reference desk, surrounded by the quiet hum of people reading and researching. Marcus had used this phone before to call the shelter or apply for jobs that never materialized. Today, it represented a connection to a future he could barely imagine. He inserted his quarters with hands that trembled so badly he nearly dropped the coins. He dialed the number 3 times before actually letting it ring through. The first 2 attempts, he hung up before anyone could answer, his nerve failing at the last second. What if this was all an elaborate mistake? What if the property management company had never heard of the Thompson family trust? What if he was about to make a fool of himself to complete strangers? On the 3rd attempt, he forced himself to stay on the line. Millfield Property Management, this is Margaret speaking, came a warm voice with a slight Montana accent. Hello, Marcus said, his voice cracking slightly. I'm calling about the Thompson family trust. I think I might be the person you've been waiting for. There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough that Marcus wondered if the connection had been lost. I'm sorry. Could you repeat that? Margaret asked, her tone shifting from routine business to careful attention. My name is Marcus Thompson, he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. For 3 years of homelessness, his name had meant nothing to anyone. Now it might be the key to everything. I believe James and Sarah Thompson were my grandparents. Another pause, then Margaret's voice returned with barely controlled excitement. Mr. Thompson, We've been managing that trust for 28 years. Could you hold, please, while I get the file? Marcus waited, feeding more quarters into the phone as the minutes ticked by. He could hear papers rustling and muffled conversations in the background. Finally, Margaret returned to the line. "Mr. Thompson, I'm going to need to verify your identity. You understand? We've had a few false claims over the years. Can you tell me your father's full name?" "Richard Thompson," Marcus replied immediately. "He died in a car accident when I was 7. My mother died too. I grew up in foster care. What was your mother's maiden name?" Marcus felt his heart sink. "I don't know. The social workers never told me much about my family history." "That's all right," Margaret said kindly. "We have ways to verify identity. Do you have any documentation with you? Birth certificate, social security card, anything with your name and parentage?" "I have my birth certificate. It shows my father as Richard Thompson, but my mother's name is listed as Patricia Johnson." "Perfect," Margaret said, and Marcus could hear the smile in her voice. "Patricia Johnson Thompson. That matches our records exactly. Mr. Thompson, I think you really might be who you say you are." Margaret explained that the farm had been maintained continuously since Sarah's death in 1995. The property management company had been following her specific instructions: keep the buildings in good repair, maintain the agricultural operations through local tenant farmers, and hold all profits in a trust account, waiting for the rightful heir to be found. The farm is currently leased to a local family who grow wheat and raise cattle, Margaret explained. They've been excellent tenants and have actually improved the property significantly over the years. The income has been substantial. Marcus asked the question he was afraid to hear answered. How substantial? "Well, that's something we'd need to discuss in person. But I can tell you that your grandparents were very careful with their instructions. They wanted to make sure their grandchild would be well provided for." Margaret's voice grew warmer as she continued. "Mr. Thompson, if you can make it to Montana, I'd like to arrange for you to see the property. We'll need to complete the legal verification process, but based on what you've told me, I'm confident we can establish your claim." Marcus gripped the phone tighter. "I don't have much money for travel." "Don't worry about that," Margaret said firmly. "The trust has provisions for expenses related to locating and verifying the heir. We can arrange transportation and accommodation. When can you come?" Marcus returned to the storage unit the next morning with renewed purpose, Margaret's words still echoing in his mind. She had asked him to gather any additional documentation he could find that might help verify his identity and family connections. He'd spent the night at the shelter unable to sleep, his mind racing with possibilities and fears in equal measure. Back in the cedar chest, Marcus began a more systematic search through the remaining documents. Beneath the property papers, he discovered a manila envelope marked "Family Records" in Sarah's careful handwriting. Inside were documents that would map out his family tree in ways he'd never imagined possible. The first document he pulled out was a birth certificate for Richard James Thompson, born October 12, 1958, in Millfield, Montana. The parents were listed as James Robert Thompson and Sarah Elizabeth Thompson. Marcus stared at the certificate, holding proof that the man listed as his father on his own birth certificate was indeed the son of James and Sarah Thompson. But there were more birth certificates in the envelope, creating a genealogical treasure trove that painted a picture of the Thompson family across 3 generations. Marcus found James's birth certificate from 1934, showing his parents as Robert Thompson and Margaret Sullivan Thompson. Sarah's birth certificate from 1936 listed her parents as Charles Mitchell and Eleanor O'Brien Mitchell. Most importantly, he found his own birth certificate, not the photocopied version he'd carried for years, but an official certified copy that Sarah had somehow obtained. Seeing it among the family documents felt like concrete, proof that he belonged to this collection of lives and stories. The envelope contained other vital records that told the story of the Thompson family's joys and sorrows, marriage certificates for James and Sarah, for James's parents, and for Sarah's parents created a web of connections stretching back to the early 1900s. Marcus traced the family names with his finger, marveling at the continuity of relationships and the care with which Sarah had preserved these documents. There was a death certificate for James, dated March 15, 1989, listing the cause of death as heart failure. He had been only 55 years old, still young enough to have met grandchildren if circumstances had been different. Sarah's death certificate, dated November 3, 1995, showed she had lived 6 years longer than her husband, dying at 59 from complications related to diabetes. Marcus found a particularly poignant document, a hospital record from 1965, showing that Sarah had given birth to a stillborn daughter. The brief medical notation couldn't capture the grief that James and Sarah must have experienced, but it explained why Richard had been their only living child. It also suggested why they had been so hopeful about grandchildren, about the continuation of their family line. Tucked between the official documents, Marcus discovered a handwritten family tree that Sarah had created, apparently in the years after James's death. Her careful script traced the Thompson lineage back several generations, with branches for cousins, aunts, and uncles that Marcus had never known existed. Some names were marked with dates of death, others with question marks and notes like lost touch or moved away. But it was Richard's branch of the family tree that captured Marcus's attention most powerfully. Sarah had written Richard James Thompson, October 12, 1958, in her careful script. Then below it, married Patricia Johnson, 1982. Below that, in different ink that suggested it had been added later, was Marcus's own name and birth date. Beside Marcus's name, Sarah had written a note that brought tears to his eyes. Our precious grandson, lost to us but never forgotten. May God watch over him until we can find him again. The envelope contained one more document that Marcus almost missed, a small piece of paper tucked into a corner. When he unfolded it, he found a handwritten note from Sarah, dated just months before her death. To my unknown grandson, the note began. If you are reading this, then God has answered my prayers and brought you home to us. Your grandfather James died, believing that family is the most important thing in the world. And I have spent every day since his death hoping that somehow, someday, you would find your way back to where you belong. Sarah's note continued with details about the trust arrangements she had made, the property management company she had hired, and her specific instructions that everything be preserved for Marcus's eventual return. She had even included suggestions for how he might want to honor his grandfather's memory and continue the family traditions that had meant so much to both of them. The farm was your grandfather's dream, Sarah wrote, but it was always meant to be a legacy for future generations. I pray that you will find happiness there, and that you will understand how much you were loved even by grandparents you never had the chance to meet. Marcus folded the note carefully and placed it back in the envelope with the birth certificates. These weren't just documents, they were proof of belonging, evidence that he had never been as alone in the world as he had believed. At the very bottom of the cedar chest, Marcus discovered what would prove to be the most intimate and revealing artifact of all, a leather-bound journal that had been wrapped in a piece of blue silk. The journal was thick, filled with hundreds of pages of Sarah's handwriting, spanning decades of daily life. The cover was embossed with the year 1960 and Sarah's initials S.E.T. Marcus opened the journal carefully, noting how the leather binding creaked with age but remained intact. The first entry was dated January 1st, 1960, written in Sarah's young, optimistic handwriting. James says I should keep a record of our life together, that someday our children will want to know what their parents were thinking and feeling. I'm not sure I have anything important to say, but I'll try to write down the small moments that make up our days. As Marcus read through the early entries, he was transported into the daily rhythms of life on the Thompson farm in the early 1960s. Sarah wrote about learning to milk cows, about failed attempts at growing tomatoes, about the satisfaction of her first successful batch of apple preserves, Her voice on the page was warm and self-deprecating, full of humor about her city girl mistakes in adapting to farm life. "James found me crying in the chicken coop today," one entry read. "I'd been trying for an hour to collect eggs, but every time I reached for one, the hens would squawk and flap at me. He showed me how to move slowly and speak softly to them. Everything on a farm responds to patience," he said. I think he was talking about more than just chickens. The journal entries from the mid-1960s revealed the joy and heartbreak that Marcus had glimpsed in the official documents. Sarah wrote extensively about her pregnancies, both the successful one that resulted in Richard's birth and the devastating loss of their daughter. "Richard took his first steps today," Sarah wrote in an entry from 1959. "James was so proud he picked him up and danced around the kitchen. Our son is going to be strong and confident just like his father." I can already see James's determination in Richard's eyes, the way he sets his jaw when he's concentrating on something. But as Marcus continued reading, he began to notice changes in Sarah's tone as Richard grew older. The entries from the 1970s and early 1980s revealed growing concern about their son's choices and behavior. "Richard came home drunk again last night," Sarah wrote in 1977. "James tried to talk to him about responsibility, about the example he's setting, but Richard just laughed and said we were old-fashioned. I pray every night that he'll find his way, but I'm beginning to fear that we've lost him to influences we can't compete with." The entries became more painful as they progressed. Richard's drinking problem escalated. He dropped out of college, and he began associating with people whom James and Sarah clearly disapproved of. The journal revealed the heartbreak of parents watching their child make destructive choices despite all their efforts to guide him. "Richard announced today that he's getting married," Sarah wrote in 1982. "Her name is Patricia, and she seems like a sweet girl, but they've only known each other for 3 months. James thinks they're too young, but I'm hoping that marriage and responsibility might help Richard settle down. Sometimes love can accomplish what lectures cannot." Marcus found himself holding his breath as he read about his parents' early marriage and his own birth. Sarah's joy was evident in every word. "Our grandson was born today, Marcus James Thompson. He has Richard's dark hair and James's strong chin. When I held him for the first time, I felt like I was holding the future of our family. This little boy will carry on the Thompson name and hopefully the Thompson values." But the joy was short-lived. The entries from Marcus's early childhood revealed increasing tension between Richard and his parents. Richard's drinking had not improved with marriage and fatherhood, and he had begun to resent what he saw as his parents' interference in his life. "Richard told us today that he doesn't want us to see Marcus anymore," Sarah wrote in an entry that made Marcus's heart ache. "He says we're too controlling, that we make him feel like a failure." James tried to reason with him, but Richard was drunk and angry. He packed up Patricia and the baby and left. "I don't know when we'll see our grandson again, or if we ever will." The final entries in the journal, written after James's death in 1989, revealed Sarah's desperate efforts to reconnect with her son and grandson. She had hired private investigators, contacted social services, and even traveled to other states following leads that never panned out. "I learned today that Richard and Patricia died in a car accident 2 years ago," Sarah wrote in one of her last entries. "Marcus would be 10 years old now, somewhere in the foster care system. I've contacted every agency I can think of, but they won't tell me anything because I'm not the legal guardian. My grandson is out there alone, and I can't find him." The journal's final entry was dated just weeks before Sarah's death. "I'm leaving everything in God's hands now. I've done all I can to find Marcus, and I've made provisions for him to inherit everything when he comes of age. I pray that somehow, someday, he'll find his way home to us. The farm will be waiting for him, along with all the love we never got to give him." Marcus sat on his cot at the shelter that evening, staring at the Greyhound bus ticket that had arrived by overnight delivery from Millfield Property Management. Margaret had been true to her word, arranging and paying for his transportation to Montana. The ticket was for a journey that would take 36 hours, with stops in 5 different cities. But it represented the most important trip of his life. The paper ticket felt substantial in his hands, printed with official logos and departure times that made his journey feel real and inevitable. Departure 6:45 a.m., destination Millfield, MT. Arrival 6:30 p.m. next day. Simple text that described a transformation Marcus could barely comprehend. He had spent the morning at the storage unit, carefully selecting which items to take with him and which to leave behind. The most important documents, birth certificates, property deeds, Sarah's journal, and the wedding album, were now safely packed in a backpack he'd purchased with money from selling some of the storage unit's more valuable items. Marcus had discovered that the unit contained several antiques worth decent money. A set of sterling silver serving pieces had brought him $300 at a local antique shop. Some of the jewelry, while not incredibly valuable, had been enough to fund his immediate needs. He felt slightly guilty about selling items that belonged to his grandparents, but he reasoned that Sarah would have wanted him to use whatever resources he needed to claim his inheritance. The shelter's night manager, Carlos, had been surprisingly supportive when Marcus explained his situation. Carlos had seen too many stories that started with hope and ended in disappointment, but there was something about Marcus's documentation that seemed legitimate. More importantly, Carlos recognized the change in Marcus himself, the way he carried himself differently, the way his eyes held hope instead of resignation. "You sure about this, man?" Carlos asked, sitting on the edge of the next cot. "Montana's a long way to go on a maybe." Marcus showed him the bus ticket again, along with Margaret's business card and the copy of the property deed he'd made at the library. "It's not a maybe anymore, Carlos. These people have been looking for me for 28 years, Carlos." Examined the documents with the careful attention of someone who had learned to distinguish between legitimate opportunities and elaborate scams. "Property management company paid for the ticket?" "Everything. Travel, accommodation while I'm there, even meals. Margaret said the trust has provisions for expenses related to finding the heir. And you're sure this is real? Not some kind of con?" Marcus had asked himself the same question dozens of times over the past few days. But the storage unit, the documents, the consistency of the story across decades of records, it all felt too elaborate and too genuine to be fabricated. "Look at this," Marcus said, opening Sarah's journal to one of the entries about searching for him. "This woman spent 6 years trying to find me after my parents died. Why would someone fake something like this?" Carlos read the journal entry, his expression growing more convinced. "Man, if this is real, you're about to go from homeless to landowner in one bus ride." Marcus packed his few remaining possessions that evening. 3 changes of clothes, his documents, a toothbrush, and the pocket watch he'd taken from the cedar chest. Everything he owned in the world fit into a single backpack. But that backpack now contained the key to a completely different life. Other shelter residents gathered around as word spread about Marcus's situation. Most were supportive, though a few expressed skepticism that seemed rooted more in their own disappointments than in realistic assessment of Marcus's evidence. "Don't forget about us little people when you're a big Montana rancher," joked Tommy, a veteran who'd been living at the shelter for 2 years. "If this works out," Marcus said seriously, "I'm going to find ways to help people who are where I was a week ago." That night, Marcus lay on his cot staring at the ceiling, too excited and nervous to sleep. In 12 hours, he would board a bus that would carry him away from 3 years of homelessness and toward a legacy he'd never known existed. The bus ticket lay on the small table beside his bed, a tangible promise that tomorrow would be different from every day that had come before. He thought about James and Sarah Thompson, about the farm they'd built, and the grandson they'd never stopped hoping to find. Tomorrow, he would begin the journey toward the life they'd always intended him to have. The Greyhound bus pulled away from the station at exactly 6:45 a.m., carrying Marcus toward a future he could barely imagine. He had claimed a window seat near the back, his backpack containing everything precious from the storage unit secured between his feet. As the city skyline disappeared behind him, Marcus pulled out the hand-drawn map that Sarah had created years ago, showing the route from Millfield to the Thompson farm. The map was drawn on cream-colored paper that had yellowed with age. Sarah's careful pencil lines marking roads, landmarks, and distances with the precision of someone who had traveled this route countless times. At the top, she had written "From town to home," 12 miles in her distinctive handwriting. The map showed every turn, every crossroad, and every notable feature. Along the way, Marcus traced the route with his finger, noting Sarah's annotations. Miller's Creek, good fishing, she had written beside a blue line representing a stream. Johnson's Farm, buy eggs here, marked a small square representing a neighboring property. Big Oak Tree, turn left, indicated a crucial intersection where the paved road gave way to gravel. The map included small drawings that brought the landscape to life even before Marcus could see it himself. Sarah had sketched the grain elevator that marked the edge of town, the old red barn that served as a landmark halfway to the farm, and the distinctive rock formation that her notes indicated was visible from the farmhouse porch. As the hours passed and the bus carried him through changing landscapes, Marcus found himself studying every detail of Sarah's map. She had drawn it with love, he realized, the careful attention of someone creating a guide for family members who might need to find their way home. The thought that she had created this map, hoping that someday her lost grandson would use it to navigate to his inheritance, brought tears to his eyes. The bus journey gave Marcus time to think about the enormity of what lay ahead. For 3 years, his world had consisted of a few city blocks, the shelter, the library, the places where he could earn a few dollars with odd jobs. Now he was traveling toward open spaces and rural communities where people knew their neighbors, and land was measured in acres rather than square feet. At a stop in Kansas, Marcus called Margaret from a payphone to confirm his arrival time. Her voice was warm and reassuring, filled with excitement about meeting him in person. "I've arranged for you to stay at the Millfield Inn tonight," she told him. "Tomorrow morning I'll pick you up and we'll drive out to see the farm. I have to warn you, Mr. Thompson, it's going to be emotional. The house has been maintained exactly as your grandmother left it." Marcus studied Sarah's map again as the bus continued westward. She had included a detailed drawing of the farmhouse itself, showing the wraparound porch, the kitchen garden, and the barn where James had kept his equipment. Beside the drawing, she had written notes that felt like messages across time. "Morning sun hits the kitchen window perfectly for coffee, and best view of sunset from the porch swing." The landscape outside the bus windows began to change as they entered Montana. The urban sprawl gave way to rolling hills, then to vast expanses of agricultural land that stretched to the horizon. Marcus had never seen so much open space, had never experienced the sense of endless possibility that came with viewing land that seemed to go on forever. As evening approached and the bus neared Millfield, Marcus felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness that made his stomach churn. According to Sarah's map, the town was small, just a few hundred people, a main street with essential businesses and farming communities scattered throughout the surrounding countryside. The map showed Millfield's layout in simple but accurate detail. Bank, post office, and grocery on Main Street, Sarah had noted. Church at the end of Elm Street, where James and I were married. She had even marked the location of the cemetery where she and James were buried. A detail that made Marcus realize he would soon be able to visit the grandparents he had never known. When the bus finally pulled into Millfield's small station, Marcus could see that Sarah's map had prepared him well. The grain elevator rose against the evening sky exactly as she had drawn it, and Main Street stretched before him with the same simple layout her map had indicated. Margaret Henley was waiting on the platform, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and graying hair. She held a sign that read "Marcus Thompson, welcome home," and when she saw him step off the bus, Her face lit up with the joy of someone who had been waiting years for this moment. As Marcus walked toward her, Sarah's map still clutched in his hand, he realized that his journey was just beginning. The next morning, Margaret picked up Marcus in a well-maintained pickup truck that seemed perfectly suited to the rural landscape. As they drove through Millfield's quiet streets, she pointed out landmarks that Marcus recognized from Sarah's map: the bank where his grandparents had done business for decades, the church where they were married, the small cafe where locals gathered for coffee and conversation. "Your grandmother was beloved in this community," Margaret said as they drove past the post office. "She taught Sunday school for 30 years, organized the annual harvest festival, and never missed a church potluck. People still talk about her apple pies." The 12-mile drive to the farm followed Sarah's hand-drawn route perfectly. Marcus watched for each landmark she had noted, feeling a growing sense of connection to the woman who had created such a detailed guide for his journey home. When they reached the big oak tree that marked the final turn, Marcus's heart began to race with anticipation. The gravel road curved through rolling pastureland before revealing the Thompson farmhouse in the distance. Marcus's first glimpse of his inheritance took his breath away. The two-story white house with its wraparound porch sat nestled among mature shade trees, exactly as Sarah had drawn it on her map. Red barns and outbuildings were arranged around the main house with the kind of thoughtful planning that spoke of people who understood how farms should work. Margaret pulled into the circular driveway and stopped near the front porch. "Before we go inside," she said gently, "I want you to see this." She reached into her purse and pulled out an antique brass key, ornate and heavy, clearly original to the house. "This is the original farmhouse key that James cut for Sarah when they moved in. She specifically requested that it be given to you when you were found." Marcus took the key, feeling its weight and warmth. The brass had developed a rich patina over the decades, and the bow was engraved with decorative scrollwork that suggested it had been specially made rather than purchased from a hardware store. This wasn't just a functional object, it was a symbol of belonging, of home, of the intention that this place would always be Marcus's sanctuary. "Sarah left very specific instructions," Margaret continued, as they walked toward the front door. "The house was to be maintained exactly as she left it, ready for your arrival. We've had cleaning services come through regularly, and everything is in perfect condition." Marcus inserted the key into the front door lock, and it turned smoothly, as if it had been waiting decades for this moment. The door opened to reveal a living room that seemed frozen in time, but in the most wonderful way possible. Comfortable furniture arranged for conversation, family photographs covering every surface, and the warm scent of wood polish and dried lavender that spoke of a house that had been loved and cared for. The farmhouse was larger than Marcus had expected, with high ceilings and large windows that filled the rooms with natural light. Hardwood floors gleamed under area rugs that showed the wear patterns of decades of family life. Every room revealed Sarah's careful attention to creating a home that was both beautiful and functional. In the kitchen, Marcus found modern appliances that had been updated over the years, but the basic layout remained true to the 1950s farmhouse style. A large wooden table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by mismatched chairs that suggested family meals where everyone gathered regardless of formality. The kitchen windows overlooked Sarah's garden, which Margaret explained was still maintained by local volunteers who remembered her fondness for flowers and vegetables. "This was Sarah's favorite room," Margaret said, watching Marcus examine the vintage canisters and ceramic mixing bowls that lined the counters. "She spent hours here every day, cooking for James, preserving food from the garden, and planning meals for church functions." Upstairs, Marcus discovered 4 bedrooms, including what was clearly the master bedroom, where James and Sarah had slept for nearly 40 years. But it was the smallest bedroom that brought tears to his eyes. Margaret opened the door to reveal a room that had been prepared for a child, painted in soft blue. furnished with a twin bed and child-sized furniture, and decorated with toys and books appropriate for a young boy. "Sarah prepared this room for you when you were born," Margaret explained quietly. "After you disappeared, she kept it exactly as it was, hoping that someday you would come home. Every year on your birthday, she would buy you a present and put it in that closet." Marcus opened the closet door to find shelves lined with wrapped gifts, each one labeled with his name and age. For Marcus, age 8. For Marcus, age 15. For Marcus, age 25. The gifts continued through the year of Sarah's death, a heartbreaking testament to a grandmother's love for a grandson she never stopped hoping to see again. Margaret led him to a window that overlooked the farm's fields and pastures. 40 acres of some of the best agricultural land in Montana, she said. "The Hendersons have been farming it for us under a lease agreement, growing wheat and raising cattle. They've done an excellent job maintaining and even improving the property." As Marcus looked out over the land that was now his, he understood why James and Sarah had chosen this place for their life together. The view stretched for miles, encompassing rolling hills, productive fields, and the kind of natural beauty that made a person understand their connection to the earth. The farmhouse key felt warm in his palm as he realized that this wasn't just property he was inheriting. It was a home that had been prepared for him with decades of love and anticipation. The next morning, Marcus woke in his childhood bedroom to the sound of vehicles pulling into the farmhouse driveway. Through the window, he could see pickup trucks and cars arriving, and people unloading covered dishes and folding chairs. Margaret had mentioned that word of his arrival had spread quickly through the farming community. But he hadn't expected such an immediate response. When he came downstairs, Margaret was already in the kitchen arranging flowers that someone had brought. "I hope you don't mind," she said with a smile, "but the neighbors wanted to welcome you home properly. This is how we do things in rural Montana when someone new arrives, especially someone with roots here. The whole community turns out." Outside on the wraparound porch, Marcus discovered that the local community had organized what appeared to be an impromptu homecoming celebration. A large banner stretched between two porch posts, hand-painted in cheerful colors with the words, "Welcome home, Marcus Thompson." The banner was clearly homemade, created with the kind of care that spoke of people who wanted to do something special for someone they'd never met but already considered family. The banner had been painted by several different hands. Marcus could tell. Children had added colorful flowers and butterflies around the edges, while adult hands had painted the letters and background. It wasn't professional, but it was infinitely more meaningful than anything store-bought could have been. As Marcus stepped onto the porch, he was greeted by what seemed like half the county. Margaret introduced him to neighbors whose families had known James and Sarah for decades. There was Bob Henderson, who had been farming Marcus's land for 15 years, along with his wife Carol and their 3 teenagers. The Jenkins family, who owned the adjacent property, had brought their famous potato salad and stories about borrowing tools from James during harvest season. "Your grandfather was the kind of neighbor everyone hopes for," Bob Henderson told Marcus as they shook hands. "Fair in his dealings, always willing to help during emergencies, and never too proud to ask for help when he needed it. I've been honored to farm this land, and I hope we can continue working together." An elderly woman named Dorothy Patterson approached Marcus with tears in her eyes. "I taught with your grandmother Sarah for 20 years, she said, pressing his hands between her own weathered ones. "She never stopped talking about you, never stopped hoping you'd come home. She would be so happy to see this day." The gathering grew throughout the morning as word continued to spread. Marcus met the pastor of the church where James and Sarah had been married, the banker who had helped manage the trust fund, and countless farmers and townspeople who remembered his grandparents with genuine affection. Children ran around the farmyard, playing games that their parents had probably played in the same space decades earlier. Their laughter mixed with adult conversations about crop yields, weather patterns, and local news, creating the soundtrack of rural community life that Marcus had never experienced but somehow recognized as familiar. The local Methodist minister, Reverend Williams, asked if he could say a few words. The crowd gathered around the porch as he spoke about James and Sarah's legacy, about the importance of family and community, and about the blessing of having Marcus finally come home to where he belonged. James and Sarah Thompson were pillars of this community, Reverend Williams said, his voice carrying across the farmyard. They believed that land was more than property. It was stewardship, responsibility, and legacy. They farmed not just for themselves, but for the future. Today, seeing their grandsons standing on this porch, we witness the fulfillment of their faith and their dreams. As the afternoon progressed, people shared stories about James and Sarah that painted a picture of lives well lived and deeply connected to their community. Marcus learned that his grandfather had served on the school board, that his grandmother had organized relief efforts during harsh winters, and that both had been known for their generous spirits and practical wisdom. The banner fluttered in the Montana breeze as neighbors began to clean up and head home to their own evening chores. Each person who left made sure to shake Marcus's hand again, to remind him that he was welcome to call if he needed anything, and to invite him to upcoming community events. As the sun began to set over the farmland that was now his, Marcus stood on the porch, looking at the welcome banner that would forever remind him of his first day as a member of this community. The banner represented more than just a greeting. It was an invitation to belong, to participate, to continue the legacy of community involvement that James and Sarah had established. Margaret helped him take down the banner as darkness fell. "Save this," she suggested as they folded it carefully. "Someday you'll want to remember how it felt to come home." Marcus knew she was right. The banner would join the collection of treasures from the storage unit, another artifact documenting his transformation from lonely homeless man to welcomed community member. In the weeks following his arrival, Marcus discovered that inheriting a farm involved far more complexity than he had imagined. Margaret had arranged meetings with agricultural consultants, financial advisors, and legal experts who could help him understand the full scope of his inheritance and the decisions he would need to make. The most valuable document in this process turned out to be a thick, leather-bound manual that Margaret retrieved from James's study. The cover was embossed with Thompson Farm Operations Manual in gold lettering, and inside were hundreds of pages of meticulous records that James had maintained throughout his farming career. James had documented everything with the thoroughness of someone who understood that successful farming required careful attention to detail and long-term planning. The manual contained soil analysis reports dating back to 1957, crop rotation schedules that maximized land productivity, detailed financial records showing income and expenses for every year of operation, and comprehensive notes about weather patterns, market conditions, and agricultural innovations. Your grandfather was 20 years ahead of his time in terms of farm management, explained Dr. Robert Chen, the agricultural consultant whom Margaret had hired to help Marcus understand his options. This manual is essentially a masterclass in sustainable farming practices. Marcus studied James's careful handwriting as Dr. Chen explained various sections of the manual. There were detailed charts showing which fields had grown, which crops in each year, ensuring that the soil remained healthy and productive. James had tracked rainfall, temperature variations, and seasonal patterns with scientific precision, creating a database of local agricultural knowledge that would have impressed university researchers. The financial sections of the manual revealed that the Thompson farm had been consistently profitable throughout James's management. Even during difficult years, when weather or market conditions created challenges, careful planning and diversified operations had maintained steady income. The manual showed how James had gradually expanded from basic grain farming to include cattle ranching, equipment rental to neighbors, and even a small apple orchard that supplied local markets. The lease arrangement with the Henderson family has been extremely successful, Dr. Chen continued, showing Marcus the recent financial reports. They've maintained the property beautifully and actually increased productivity through modern equipment and techniques that complement your grandfather's sustainable practices. The trust account that had been accumulating for nearly 3 decades contained resources that Marcus could barely comprehend. Beyond the farm's annual income, Sarah had made careful investments that had grown substantially over time. The total value of his inheritance approached $2 million when land, improvements, equipment, and accumulated funds were combined. Marcus met with Jennifer Walsh, a financial advisor from the county's seat, who helped him understand his options for managing such substantial assets. The beautiful thing about your situation, she explained, is that the farm is already profitable and well managed. You can choose to maintain the current arrangements while you learn about agriculture, or you can gradually become more involved in day-to-day operations. The manual contained a section that particularly moved Marcus, James's thoughts about the future of the farm. Written in the 1980s, these pages revealed his hopes for the next generation of Thompson farmers. "This land has been good to our family," James had written, "but it requires stewardship, not just ownership. I hope that whoever inherits this farm will understand that we are caretakers for future generations." James had included detailed recommendations for improvements and expansions that could be made over time. He had researched new farming techniques, identified opportunities for additional income streams, and even sketched plans for updating farm buildings while maintaining their historical character. His vision extended decades into the future, anticipating changes in agriculture and markets that proved remarkably prescient. Dr. Chen helped Marcus understand that modern farming operations required different skills than those needed in James's era. "Your grandfather's manual provides an excellent foundation," he said, "but you'll want to learn about current technology, environmental regulations, and market opportunities that didn't exist 30 years ago." They discussed options for Marcus's involvement in farm operations. He could continue the lease arrangement with the Hendersons while gradually learning about agriculture through part-time participation. Alternatively, he could enroll in agricultural extension programs that would teach him modern farming techniques while honoring the sustainable practices that James had pioneered. The manual included detailed maps of every field building and improvement on the property. Marcus could see how James had planned each addition to the farm, with careful consideration of efficiency, aesthetics, and long-term functionality. The barn placements maximized protection from winter winds while allowing easy access for equipment. The fencing systems managed livestock movement while preserving the farm's natural beauty. As Marcus sat in James's study, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime of farming, he felt the weight of responsibility and opportunity. The Farm Operations Manual wasn't just a collection of records, it was a roadmap for continuing a legacy of stewardship and success. For the first time since discovering the storage unit, Marcus began to envision not just receiving an inheritance, but actively building upon the foundation that James and Sarah had created for him. 3 months after settling into his new life in Montana, Marcus felt compelled to return to the city where his transformation had begun. He wanted to thank the people who had helped him during his darkest days and to share his extraordinary story with others who might be struggling as he once had. Most importantly, he wanted to give back to the shelter that had provided him with safety when he had nowhere else to go. Marcus drove back to the city in a used pickup truck he'd purchased with his first distribution from the trust fund. In the passenger seat beside him sat a leather portfolio containing a cashier's check that represented his commitment to helping others escape the cycle of homelessness. The check was made out to Westside Emergency Shelter for $50,000. an amount that would fund operations for several months and allow the shelter to expand its services. When Marcus walked through the shelter's front door, Carlos barely recognized him. 3 months of regular meals, clean clothes, and the confidence that comes with security had transformed Marcus's appearance dramatically. But it was the change in his demeanor that was most striking. The way he carried himself, the hope in his eyes, the sense of purpose that radiated from him. "Man, look at you," Carlos said, embracing his former resident with genuine emotion. "You clean up pretty good for a guy who used to sleep in the corner bed." Marcus laughed, remembering the countless nights he'd spent in that corner, wondering if his circumstances would ever improve. "Carlos, I need to tell you about what happened after I left here. And I need to talk to whoever runs this place about something important." The shelter director, Maria Santos, emerged from her office when Carlos explained that Marcus had returned with a story to share. Maria was a woman in her 50s who had dedicated her life to helping the homeless community, and she remembered Marcus as one of the many people who had passed through their doors over the years. "Marcus, it's wonderful to see you doing well," Maria said warmly. "Carlos told me you inherited some property in Montana. How are you adjusting to such a big change?" Marcus pulled the cashier's check from his portfolio and handed it to Maria. "I inherited more than property. Maria, I inherited the means to help other people who are where I was 3 months ago." Maria looked at the check, her eyes widening as she processed the amount. "Marcus, this is incredibly generous, but are you sure? This is a substantial sum." "It's exactly what I'm sure about," Marcus replied. "This shelter saved my life by giving me a safe place to stay while I figured out my next steps. Without that stability, I never would have been able to bid on that storage unit. Never would have discovered my family's legacy." Marcus explained his story in detail, showing them photographs of the farm, copies of the documents he'd discovered, and descriptions of the community that had welcomed him home. Maria and Carlos listened with amazement as he described the transformation from homeless man to property owner, from someone with no family connections to someone surrounded by a caring community. "But the most important thing I learned," Marcus continued, "is that everyone deserves a chance to discover their potential. Some people just need a safe place to stay while they figure out their next move. The donation would allow the shelter to expand its services beyond emergency accommodation." Maria explained that they had been hoping to add job training programs, mental health counseling, and assistance with obtaining identification documents, services that could help people transition from temporary shelter to permanent housing. "We want to name the new programs in your honor," Maria suggested. "The Marcus Thompson Transition Services." Marcus shook his head. "Name them after my grandparents, the James and Sarah Thompson Hope Program. They're the ones who never gave up believing that lost family members could be found and brought home." Over the following days, word of Marcus's story spread through the shelter and the broader homeless community. People who had known him during his 3 years on the streets could barely believe the transformation. Some were inspired by the possibility that their own circumstances might change. Others were simply grateful that someone who had experienced their struggles was now in a position to help. Marcus spent a week in the city, not just donating money, but volunteering his time to help current shelter residents navigate the systems that could improve their situations. He helped people apply for benefits, obtain identification documents, and connect with job training programs. His experience with bureaucracy and his newfound confidence made him an effective advocate for others. Before leaving to return to Montana, Marcus established an ongoing relationship with the shelter. He committed to providing quarterly donations and to returning several times each year to share his story with new residents who might benefit from hearing about his journey from desperation to hope. The cashier's check had been just the beginning of Marcus's commitment to giving back. It represented not just financial support, but the fulfillment of a promise he had made to himself during his darkest days, that if his circumstances ever improved, He would help others who were struggling as he once had. 1 year after Marcus first opened Storage Unit 47B, he stood on the wraparound porch of the Thompson farmhouse, holding a newly framed photograph that would complete the family legacy his grandparents had begun. The photograph showed Marcus at the annual Harvest Festival, surrounded by his Montana neighbors, holding a trophy for Best New Farmer that the County Agricultural Society had awarded him for his first successful crop. The photograph had been taken by Dorothy Patterson, Sarah's former teaching colleague, who had insisted that important moments needed to be documented for future generations. In the picture, Marcus wore work clothes that bore the honest dirt of farming, and his face showed the contentment that comes from meaningful work and community belonging. This updated family portrait would join the collection of photographs that chronicled the Thompson family story across generations. Marcus had carefully arranged the farmhouse's photo displays to tell the complete narrative. James and Sarah's wedding pictures, images from their farming years, photographs of their son Richard as a child, and now Marcus's pictures from his new life as a Montana farmer. The photograph represented more than just documentation of Marcus's success. It symbolized the continuation of values that James and Sarah had hoped to pass down through generations: hard work, community service, stewardship of the land, and commitment to helping others. Marcus had not only inherited property, but had embraced the responsibilities that came with being a Thompson. Over the past year, Marcus had transformed from someone who knew nothing about agriculture into a respected member of the farming community. He had enrolled in agricultural extension programs, learned modern farming techniques, and gradually taken over more responsibility for managing his land. The Henderson family continued to partner with him, sharing their expertise while allowing him to make his own decisions about the farm's future. The Harvest Festival trophy represented recognition that Marcus had successfully honored his grandfather's legacy while adapting to contemporary farming challenges. His wheat crop had been exceptional. His sustainable practices had impressed agricultural experts, and his willingness to share knowledge with other farmers had earned widespread respect. Marcus had also expanded the farm's community involvement beyond anything James and Sarah had imagined. The James and Sarah Thompson Hope Program had grown from a shelter donation into a comprehensive foundation that helped homeless individuals transition to stable housing and employment. The foundation operated from an office in the renovated barn, creating jobs for local residents while serving people across the region. Every month, Marcus hosted groups from homeless shelters, showing them the farm and sharing his story of transformation. Many visitors left inspired by the possibility that their circumstances could change. Some had even relocated to Montana, where the foundation helped them find housing and employment in agricultural communities that needed workers. The photograph would be displayed in the farmhouse living room alongside images of 3 generations of Thompsons, creating a visual timeline that showed how family legacies could survive interruption and separation. Marcus often sat in James's favorite chair, looking at these photographs and feeling connected to grandparents he had never met, but whose values he had inherited along with their property. The annual Harvest Festival had become Marcus's favorite community event, a celebration that embodied everything he loved about his new life. Neighbors gathered to share food, stories, and the satisfaction of another successful growing season. Children played the same games their parents had enjoyed decades earlier. Farmers compared notes about crops, weather, and plans for the following year. During this year's festival, Marcus had announced his engagement to Rebecca Chen, Dr. Chen's daughter, who had moved back to Montana after completing her veterinary degree. Their relationship had grown from shared interests in sustainable agriculture and community service into a love that reminded longtime residents of the devotion James and Sarah had shared. Rebecca understood Marcus's commitment to honoring his grandparents' memory while building a future that served the broader community. She had enthusiastically joined the foundation's work and brought her own ideas about expanding services to include agricultural education for urban youth. As evening light faded over the farmland that was now truly his home, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him from that dusty storage unit to this porch where his grandparents had once planned their own future. The photograph in his hands documented not just personal success, but the fulfillment of James and Sarah's deepest hopes that their grandson would find his way home and continue the legacy of love, service, and stewardship they had spent their lives building. The Thompson family story would continue into another generation, carried forward by someone who understood that the greatest inheritances are not measured in dollars or acres, but in values lived and shared with others who need hope, opportunity, and the chance to discover their own potential for transformation.